Welcome and thank you for joining me as we continue to ponder our way through the Psalms. As we enter a new section today, I thought I'd just give you a quick reminder, as I do from time to time, that the purpose of this series is not to give you an exhaustive exposition of each of the Psalms. We don't have the time to do that, and that's not the intention. All I want to do is introduce you to each of the Psalms, give you a feeling of its overview, its main theme, and perhaps some hints about the construction of it as we look at it and draw out some of the pressing thoughts from it. And now, having worked our way through Psalm 119, we begin to look at a group of psalms known collectively as the songs or psalms of ascent. And you will notice, if you have a good translation of the Bible, that Psalms 120 through to 134 all have that as a title at the beginning of the Psalms. So let me just take a moment to set the scene for these 15 Psalms. We need to remember, of course, that Old Testament worshippers did not, as we do, meet in local congregations Sabbath by Sabbath, week by week. Indeed, local synagogues, as we're familiar with them in the New Testament, only came into being in the post-exilic period. In other words, in the last 500 to 600 years of the Old Testament. Up to then, worship would have been very much family-based. But on certain special occasions, and they were momentously special for the people of God, Passover, Pentecost, and the Day of Atonement, all the Hebrew men were required to make their way to Jerusalem and to the temple to take part in these great moments of national spiritual worship, remembrance, and celebration. And these 15 Psalms of Ascent appear to have been used by the pilgrims as they made their way up to Jerusalem. And by the way, you always went up to Jerusalem from wherever you were traveling. It was expressed that way to signify the importance of the city. Almost certainly, these Psalms of Ascent were a self-contained hymn book in itself. And it was probably, when the Psalter, as we have it, was put together, incorporated then into Book 4 of our Psalms. It also appears that these Psalms are arranged in such a way as to reflect the progress of the journey, beginning with the worshippers being far away from Jerusalem, until finally in Psalm 134, they have at last reached Mount Zion and entered into the joy of collective worship. Given that these occasions were, relatively speaking, so much less frequent than we are used to, we can perhaps sense and understand and appreciate something of the excitement and sense of anticipation that these Old Testament pilgrims would have experienced as they traveled and came together ever nearer to the place that for them symbolized the very presence of God, and where they would worship with other believers. Perhaps if they had known of it and wanted to sing something extra biblical, as it were, as they traveled, they might have sung the great words written by Isaac Watts. Come, we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upwards to Zion, the beautiful city of God. You know, in a very small way, perhaps we can identify just a little with this sentiment, having recently experienced months when we were not able to meet together as we were used to doing. And I wonder whether we have taken this privilege for granted for so long. I'm also troubled by so many professing believers who appear to have no desire, no passion to meet with fellow believers regularly for worship. Our Old Testament brothers and sisters would, I am sure, be horrified. So we begin with Psalm 120. And we begin, so it would seem, as this anonymous worshipper was, far from home, far from their spiritual home. Indeed, Jerusalem isn't mentioned in this psalm. And because they are geographically distant from Zion, they are also feeling spiritually distant. If you look at the places mentioned in verse 3, Meshech was probably an area in Turkey, many hundreds of miles away from Judah, never mind Jerusalem. And Kedar was an area of the Arabian desert, inhabited by descendants of Ishmael. And you may remember it's mentioned, for example, in the Song of Solomon. Now, no one person or one group of people could both live away to the northwest in Turkey and down southeast in Kedar. So it would seem as if our psalmist is using these as representative reference points for pilgrims traveling from afar. It must have seemed from the ends of the earth in order to be in Jerusalem. And this opening song of ascent could be summed up in the title of the old spiritual, "This world is not my home." You can divide this short psalm into two halves, each of which highlights the torment the psalmist is experiencing as he lives far away from the people of God. In 1 to 4, we read that the world is full of lie mongers. And in 5 to 7, the world is full of warmongers. In the first part, you can acutely feel, can't you, the pain that the writer feels as all around him, all the time, all he hears are lying and deceitful words. And he calls to the Lord for help. And according to verse 1, he receives it. Now, I believe the help comes in the form of the assurance in verses 3 to 4 that God also hears their lies and deceit and will hold them to account. Indeed, they will be painfully and violently destroyed by a warrior's arrows and by hot coals. Incidentally, it was believed by many Arabs, and may still be believed by them, that the coals formed from burning the broom tree mentioned in verse 4 were the hottest coals of all. And that's the reason for the imagery that's used here. The Bible has a great deal to say about the tongue, doesn't it, and how we use it. And while we shouldn't be surprised when we hear ungodly people treating truth lightly and speaking falsehoods, we should remember that God hears it as well and takes it very seriously. We should also be reminded that absolutely truthful statements should be the only language we as believers are known for. There's no place whatsoever for being, as it is sometimes put, economical with the truth. Then verses 5 to 7 speak about the world being full of warmongers. Is there anything more characteristic of the fallen world of human beings than the ever-present horrors and reality of war and conflict, of hostility and enmity, whether it be between individuals or nations? And you don't have to look far, do you, to find at any time an example of it. But we, like the psalmist in verse 7, should be men and women of peace. And not just that, but we should be peacemakers, as those are the ones, as Jesus says in Matthew 5, those are the ones who will receive and experience the blessing of God. And the context of that very familiar beatitude, of course, is about the peace that comes through the person and work of Christ, who is the Prince of Peace. So it seems to me that in this first Psalm of Ascent, what we are supposed to reflect on above all else is that for the child of God, this world is not our home. We should feel out of place. We should feel like strangers and aliens who speak a different language, who live by different values. One of the things that should really trouble us today, as churches and as individuals, is that we are far too much at home in this world and far too much like the world. And we don't cry in distress to God as the psalmist did. I want to go home.